The air inside the cave felt even heavier than usual in the June heat of Okinawa. The shock waves from shelling travelled through the rock, shaking loose fine dust from above in a ceaseless grey rain. The equipment of the radio listening unit trembled faintly under each impact, the metal casings giving off a nearly imperceptible ringing sound. When Setsuko Mori adjusted the dials, her fingertips were as steady as if nailed to an invisible track, even though the old injury in her ear sent a sharp stab of pain through her skull after every explosion. She did not leave any time for the pain. That habit had long since been trained into her body as a rhythm. Within 7 seconds she had to complete judgment, recording, and verification, with no room for hesitation. The next blast shook the cave and knocked one side of her headphones askew. She pressed them back into place with an almost reflexive speed, clean, precise, with no wasted motion. Her breathing, briefly thrown off, fell back into alignment, as if her body knew that nothing beyond those 7 seconds was allowed to be out of balance. The interior of the cave was crowded and damp. As a supporting auxiliary passed by her, he noticed that the rim of her ear was already red and swollen. He held out a cloth-wrapped bundle of alcohol pads. She did not so much as glance at it. Her wrist tilted, and she pushed the cloth back toward him. The movement had the clipped finality peculiar to members of the listening unit, unnecessary, no outside interference. The auxiliary had an impulse to urge her once more, but another wave of shelling shook the cave and cut off his words, forcing him to move on. The injury to her ear had persisted for many days. After the original bandaging loosened, only the bare minimum of covering had been redone. In a previous concussion from shell fire, she had been almost blown off her feet and then shoved back into position at her post. She had watched as others in her unit, far more badly hurt, had their heads roughly forced down while bandages were refastened, then were slapped once on the shoulder to indicate they should get back to work. Every action conserved time. They did not treat pain, they simply judged can continue or cannot continue. She demanded the same of herself. During one listening session, her handwriting tilted for a second under the vibration. She immediately rewrote the line and reconfirmed the channel. It was the only detectable misstep she made the entire night. She used 7 seconds to correct it, then plunged back into the next segment of signal. The cave was saturated with a humid current of air that mixed the smell of soil and sweat. The static from the listening device spread constantly through her ears, pressing on her meninges like a weight, but she did not shift her posture once in response. By evening, the temperature in the air had risen. Heat, trapped deep in the cave, began slowly pushing outward. Setsuko rose to switch out for a brief rotation, but as she took her first step, a hollow, downward-sinking sensation opened suddenly in her chest. She paused, for only half a second. That was the outermost limit she allowed herself, and then kept walking. An auxiliary noticed that her steps were slightly unsteady and reached out to steady her arm. She pushed his hand away at once, calmly and firmly. She did not say a word, but the refusal itself was unmistakably clear. She never allowed anyone to see that she needed help. She believed that the moment she accepted a supporting hand would be the moment she was removed from her post. Outside the cave came a more concentrated burst of shelling. The impact shook loose a spray of rock fragments near the entrance. She took 7 seconds to complete her assessment. Distance of origin, intensity of shockwave, whether the headphones needed recalibration, and then continued toward the exit. Every movement carried the rhythm carved into her bones by training, even as the pain inside her ear had become a pulsing mass driven to feverish intensity, striking again and again against the inside of her skull. At the mouth of the cave, the air carried the sweet metallic tang of gunpowder residue. Wind rose from the ground, pushing hot humidity into her nostrils. She tried to suppress the pain in her head with a deep breath, but the dust and smoke in the air made inhaling more difficult. She lifted a hand and pressed it to the side of her head. The skin around her ear was burning hot, and the pain had crept down along the side of her neck. Another shock rolled out beneath her feet like a blow. The slope of loose rock just outside the cave shivered and shifted. Her heel drew a small arc on the sliding stones as her footing slipped. She tried to correct her balance on her toes, but in that instant she felt a sudden blackness spreading outward from the center of her vision, as though some curtain was sweeping in to swallow the light. She tried in those 7 seconds to restore her breathing, steady herself, and judge whether she could go on working. But this time, her body did not give her 7 seconds. In the first second, the ground slid under her. In the second, the pain in her ear split open like tearing cloth. In the third, her vision flared white. In the fourth, she reached for the rock face. In the fifth, her hand slipped free. In the sixth, something in her chest gave a short, hollow thud. By the seventh second, her whole body was falling forward. She did not cry out. She did not flail. She did not try to catch herself. It was as if the invisible line that had held her upright until now had been cut. She toppled quietly down the dark, broken slope of stone outside the cave. In those 7 seconds, for the first time, she could not decide her own posture. She did not lose consciousness immediately. Amid the rolling sound of gravel, she felt her body tilt stiffly onto its side, one arm trapped at an unnatural angle beneath her. Pebbles dug into her ribs, sharp edges sliced the skin in an instant. In the moment of impact, the pain in her ear turned numb, as if all her sensations had been compressed into a single point and then abruptly released. Her breathing became shallow. Something seemed to be lodged in her chest, interfering with the motion of drawing in air. She tried to lift her head, but it was as if her neck had been buried in mud. Even the smallest turn required effort she didn't have. The circle of light at the cave entrance fractured before her eyes, rippling like an image distorted by water. She heard shouting in the distance and footsteps, the steady rhythm of American military boots crunching over rock. But those sounds were muffled by the dull roar inside her injured ear, leaving only a vague, blurred vibration. She had no idea how much time passed. She only knew that each breath felt like dragging a coarse rope through her lungs, scraping a trail of raw pain. She tried to push herself up. Her fingers dug at the loose stones, but managed only to gather a handful of dust that crumbled uselessly between them. Not far away, an American patrol heard the disturbance. Beams of light from their flashlights swept toward her. When the brightness fell across her face, she instinctively turned her head aside. Not to protect herself, but to maintain the most basic form of discipline. Do not let the enemy see too much of your expression. Her consciousness was fragmented into shards. As the light passed over her, her mind flashed back to a single line from a training instructor. Even if you fall, hold yourself in a recoverable posture. Now her limbs were sprawled in all directions like snapped supports. She could not put herself back in order. One of the patrol soldiers called out softly, then ran closer. The boots in her peripheral vision looked solid and measured, not aggressive, but they still triggered an instinctive recoil. She tried to move away, but her body could only manage a faint twitch. The soldier crouched beside her and laid his hand gently on her shoulder. The touch was so light it barely had weight, yet it made her entire body jolt, because her training had never covered a scenario like this. The enemy not throwing her down, not twisting her arms, not shouting at her, but simply holding her in place as she tried to get up. She misread that quietness as a deeper form of humiliation. In the next second, her body began to struggle, the movements short and frantic, as if some internal pressure had forced out a raw, instinctive resistance. The patrol soldier did not dare to restrain her with force. He could only steady her upper body with both hands and speak brief, calm phrases, telling her not to move. She did not understand the words, but she sensed a steadiness in the tone that she could not process. Stability to her was not a comfort, it was a source of stronger fear. Without obvious violence to predict, without crude treatment to push back against, she had no idea where to place this unexpected contact. Within a few seconds, her strength broke. The struggle collapsed into shivering. The soldier signaled for a stretcher. A blanket was laid over wooden slats, and they moved to lift her. The moment someone's hands touched her waist, her muscles went rigid, as if every fiber had contracted at once. Her fingers clawed at the ground, resisting the pull that was taking her away from the direction of the front. The patrol had to divide their strength carefully. One man securing her shoulders, another easing her arm free from where it was pinned, to keep the bones from being damaged by an awkward angle. When they raised her, a breath escaped her chest, a nearly inaudible gasp. It was not a cry of pain, but a short, broken sound rooted in shame. She felt her body being lifted like a wet cloth, turned and carried without strength of its own, and she refused to admit this to herself. She tried to keep her body rigid, but the jolt of the stretcher moving over the rock slope loosened her in spite of herself. Her training had told her that being carried off the battlefield brought disgrace to one's unit. She could still picture a lightly wounded comrade being taken away on a stretcher, the agony and shame on his face. But at least he had been able to show loyalty through his earlier actions. Now she could not even push away the hands of the Americans. Once the stretcher reached level ground, the scene steadied around her. Her consciousness flickered in and out with the motion of the lights. In the night, the tents of the field hospital glowed pale yellow. The light seeped out like a thin film, trembling softly in the wind. As they carried her toward it, a new feeling rose in her chest, one she had never experienced before. Not fear, not anger, but a shame so intense that it made her want to twist off the stretcher and roll back down. She tried to resist again, but her wrists no longer had strength. Her body could only twist slightly within the straps and the hands holding the frame, as if trying to return to the place where she had fallen. The patrol noticed her distress and adjusted the height of the stretcher, lessening the jolts. Their movements were quick and practiced, but not rough. They did not tie her down, they did not pin her legs. They simply did everything they could to keep her from being hurt further as they carried her. This way of handling her disturbed her more than any brutality would have. When the stretcher was brought under the hospital's outer awning, she smelled the sharp sting of alcohol, mixed with the scent of earth and plastic sheeting. The smell was too clean, completely at odds with the battlefield air she knew. Her consciousness jolted again, as if forced into a rhythm that was not her own. They placed her beside a simple cot frame, her head tilted slightly to one side. She lifted her eyes and saw an electric lamp hanging from the beam. The light was clear, steady, unclouded by smoke. Its stability stirred a strangely disproportionate unease in her. A medic approached, his movements brisk and efficient but devoid of any hint of attack. He checked her breathing first, then lightly rolled back her sleeve to observe the color of her skin. At that moment, she yanked her arm away as if his touch were flame. He stepped back half a pace but showed no irritation. He simply shifted his position and continued his examination from another angle. Her gaze was drawn taut, pupils slightly dilated, as though she could retreat her awareness at any second. A few seconds later, he signaled to the side for a tool, a thin glass thermometer. The moment she saw its shape, a short, reflexive reaction snapped through her, as though she meant to block it. She did not know why, but that slender, transparent object frightened her more than any visible weapon. Her training had told her the enemy would never treat her gently. Therefore, any sign of gentleness felt like the prelude to true pain. Holding the thermometer up where she could see it, the medic used a brief, simple gesture to show that he wanted her to open her mouth. Her breath froze. Her chest locked in half a second. She did not understand the meaning of his hand signal, only that an unfamiliar sliver of glass was approaching her lips. In her world, accepting such a mild, careful gesture was harder than taking a blow. Violence she could understand. Gentleness she could not. She turned her head aside. The thermometer brushed against her jaw, leaving a streak of cold on her skin. She assumed this was some kind of test before humiliation, and her body burst into a sudden, violent struggle, as if she could rub that coldness off her face. The medic snatched the thermometer back quickly to keep it from breaking. His motion was emotionless, but it made her feel an inexplicable pressure. Her awareness began to scatter. She could not make sense of why the enemy approached her this way. She did not know what their actions meant. She only knew that every touch made her feel as though her dignity was being shaved away inch by inch. In her imagination, the enemy should have been crude, shouting, out of control. The reality was the opposite. Quiet, steady, precise. The contrast struck her like a blow, smashing what remained of her inner order into pieces. When the medic raised the thermometer for the second time, a wave of panic surged up from deep within her chest, crushing her breath. Her hand trembled as she lifted it, trying to push everything in front of her away, but her strength failed her. It felt as if her body was teetering at the edge of something she could not see, and every move the enemy made drove that edge closer. She knew she was about to explode. Her breathing grew rapid, her muscles quivered, and her fingertips clamped on the edge of the bed as if grasping for life. She could no longer bear any further contact. Her chest rose and fell in jagged bursts. The field hospital lights shone steadily, indifferent to the shelling outside, their rhythm unbroken. The cold, regular illumination clashed violently with her disordered breathing. As he lifted the thermometer again, the medic already understood that she was experiencing severe resistance, but he was bound to complete the examination. He slowed his movements slightly, drawing the thermometer closer in a clear, predictable arc, hoping she would recognize that this was a medical procedure, not an attack. To Setsuko, that precise arc did not read as gentleness, but as a deeper form of control. In her experience, the enemy never bothered with patience. Any slowing of movement could only mean that something harsher was coming next. She saw the thin glass pass along her cheek as if marking a line. She saw numbers being written on a chart, as if she were being assigned to some unknown category. She saw tissues laid out on the medical table, as if prepared to wipe up the aftermath of her humiliation. None of this matched any memory she had. Her training told her, actions with no referent in memory are dangerous. As the medic moved closer again, she suddenly surged up off the bed. The movement was quick, violent, an arc more like a cornered animal than a patient. Her arms swept sideways and struck the tray beside her. The metal clattered as it flipped over, glass vials, cotton pads, and forceps scattering across the floor. The medic instinctively stepped back, while two assistants rushed in to hold her shoulders. Her body seemed less intent on attacking than on escaping touch altogether. She thrashed without clear direction, her muscles tightening in a stance that fought the entire situation rather than any one person. The first assistant tried to pin her forearm but found his hand sliding on the sweat-soaked skin. Her arm slipped free and swung upward, her fingertips grazing the cable beneath the lamp and making the light sway. The swinging light threw her into a deeper confusion. As the brightness rocked back and forth, she thought someone was about to rush in and pin her. Her heart pounded. The old wound in her ear began to buzz. The world warped around her. Her other hand flew to the side of her head, clawing at the source of the pain. In the process, she caught the edge of the bandage and tore it loose. The cloth slackened and the wound was left exposed. Blood, as if suddenly reawakened, began to seep out. The medic signaled urgently for fresh dressings. A nurse darted to the supply cabinet, but before she could return, Setsuko had already forced herself half upright on the bed, driving her shoulders forward with all the force she could muster. The bed frame screeched against the floorboards as it skidded back a fraction, bumping into a crate behind it. Her knees bent as if she meant to roll off the bed, but she lacked the strength, managing only a weak slide across the mattress. Her breathing was broken and erratic. Faint, ragged sounds slipped from her throat. Not sobs, not groans, but fragments of terror escaping against her will. She did not truly intend to run. She simply could not withstand so many actions converging on her at once. Her training had never allowed her to become an object of handling, and now she was being handled as a patient. Her defenses were collapsing layer by layer from the inside. The medic approached again, this time using the briefest possible words to steady her mind. He lifted a tissue, motioning for her to wipe the blood and dirt from her hands so he could proceed. In her understanding, being ordered to clean your own body was a humiliating command. Soldiers who did not serve their bodies to the utmost did not deserve treatment. The sight of the tissue made her eyes contract in panic, her entire body going taut as if shocked. She slapped the tissue away with a rigid, violent motion. It floated down, weightless, landing on the muddied canvas floor like a small piece of cloth already declared defeated. Immediately after, her fingertips flew back to her ear, tugging more fiercely at the loosened bandage. The medic reached to stop her, but she twisted her wrist at an impossible angle, leaving his hand grasping empty air. It seemed she wanted to tear the wound wider, to seize control of the moment through self-inflicted harm. Her shoulders strained into an arch while the lower half of her body shuddered with weakness from dehydration and infection. A nurse tried to hold her knees still and was struck on the thigh by a sudden kick, stumbling 2 steps backward. Another assistant stepped in at once, slipping his arms under her armpits from behind to keep her from sliding off the bed in the next convulsion. The thermometer was lifted again from the tray. This time the medic altered his approach. He no longer tried to place it directly in her mouth. Instead, he crept forward slowly, intending to let her grow accustomed to its presence. But when she saw the glint of glass in the lamp's light, something dragged her back into a deeper layer of fear. Her body snapped backward with speed, a reflexive dodge that slammed her spine into the metal rail of the bed. The impact made a deep, hollow thud. The blow did not stop her. It only drove her into a fiercer struggle. Her right hand clawed at the air until it caught a fold of her own clothing. She yanked outward with a wild jerk. The fabric tore under the unplanned burst of strength, exposing her shoulder to the light. Her skin was flushed by fever, slick with sweat running down along her collarbone. She had not torn the cloth to escape it, but as a kind of destructive posture, an attempt to fight control by destroying something material. For half a second, as the shredded cloth fell to the floor, the whole tent fell still. In that half-second, everyone saw what was in her eyes, a mixture of despair, shame, and terror, a state beyond the reach of language. Her body was calling for rescue and at the same time violently rejecting every act of care. For the first time, the nurse's face showed outright alarm. The medic immediately motioned for her to come in from the side and help, abandoning the idea of having Setsuko clean herself and focusing instead on covering the wound as fast as possible. Their hands sped up, still within the measured discipline of medical training. No grabbing, no cursing, no roughness, only effort to be quick. To Setsuko, these quick yet quiet actions were more terrifying than any beating. Her breathing surged, her chest heaving with exaggerated force. Fear triggered tremors in her limbs. Her arms no longer lashed about like claws but shook with high-frequency shudders. Her body bounced faintly on the bed with each breath as if every inhalation forced her muscles to revolt. The medic had to calm her. He lifted the thermometer once more, intending to seize one relatively steady breath in which to slide it in place. When it came within 2 finger breadths of her jaw, she suddenly snapped at the air, jaws closing as if she meant to bite through anything that came near. The thermometer was withdrawn at once before her teeth could reach it. She was not trying to hurt anyone. She simply could not tolerate opening any entry point in front of the enemy. She defended her final boundary by biting. The atmosphere in the tent tightened. Everyone present understood. She was not stubborn, not refusing to cooperate for its own sake. This was the collision of trained shame reflex with unfamiliar gentleness. It was a defensive stance pushed to the limit. She could not sustain it. The violence of her struggle drove her breathing into a dangerously shallow pattern. Her chest could no longer fully expand. Her head sagged to one side. Sweat from her forehead slid down along her cheeks and dropped onto the bedding. Her torn collar hung open, her fevered skin shining under the light as if coated in a thin layer of moisture. The medic and nursing staff moved in all at once. 2 pairs of hands held her shoulders. Another held down her jerking leg. Another gripped her wrist to keep her from harming herself again. Even though their numbers nearly encircled her, their movements remained restrained, without a trace of violence. In their hands, Setsuko looked like a frightened bird, eyes wide with terror, yet with no strength left to fight. As her movements were compressed into a final frenzy, a slow but sharp question surfaced in her mind. Why weren't they striking her? Why were they not beating her, not shouting at her, not forcing her head down? Why had they not punished her for resisting? Those few seconds of confusion shifted her movements out of rhythm. In that brief pause, the medic anchored her wrist with a firm but safe grip, channeling her remaining strength away from harm. The nurse rapidly secured the bandage, while another assistant brought a tray of disinfected pads to the bed, ready to press against the edges of the wound to stop the fresh bleeding. Their actions were precise and swift, yet still governed by the same self-control she could not fathom. Her awareness dimmed again. The light blurred above her. And beneath that haze, a feeling arose in her that ran deeper than fear. She realized she was being protected by multiple enemies at once. 2 hands pressed lightly on her shoulders. One hand supported her head. Another steadied her body as it threatened to slide down. She did not know whether this protection was real, or whether it could vanish at any moment. She only knew one thing. This was the first time in her life she had ever been treated like this. Her last reserves of strength burned away in the contradiction of that protection. Her whole body lost its fierce tension, leaving only a faint tremor in its place. Just before she went completely limp, hurried footsteps sounded outside the tent flap. The hospital had decided what to do with her next. The footsteps on the gravel beat out a short, clipped rhythm and stopped at the entrance. The canvas lifted. An American medical officer stepped inside, the insignia on his shoulder catching the light. The tension in the air had not completely dissipated. Setsuko still trembled slightly from exhaustion on the bed, her collar torn, her breathing shallow and irregular. The medics and nurses clustered around her, still working, pressing her shoulders, cleaning the wound, fastening new bandages. The scattered instruments on the floor, the crumpled, sweat-soaked tissues, and the tray only just set upright, all testified to how violent the struggle had been. The medical officer took in the scene with a single sweep of his gaze. In just a few seconds he understood the situation. He asked no questions and showed no surprise. He glanced at the unused thermometer in the nurse's hand, then looked into Setsuko's eyes. They were still braced, pupils tight, as if ready to bolt again. He did not approach her. Instead, he turned to the military police at his side and issued a few brief orders. The military policeman nodded and flipped open a notebook. Under the lamp, their shadows wavered across the paper. At the bedside, the medics continued with their tasks, voices low but steady. Setsuko could not follow their words, but she could read the absence of hostility in their timing. That steady pattern had no category in her mind, but each repeated action, securing her wrist, holding her leg, wiping sweat away, checking her pupils, felt like someone pulling her back from the edge. From the side, the medical officer watched the range of her movements, confirming that she remained in a state of fever, confusion, and collapse. A nurse handed him the initial assessment form. He scanned it quickly. Consciousness fluctuating repeatedly. Marked tendency toward self-harm. Unable to cooperate with examination. Heart rate excessively elevated. Body temperature cannot be accurately obtained. The last line was underlined. Body temperature unobtainable. This signaled that her condition might be more serious than it appeared. He tapped the edge of the form with his pen, as if sealing a conclusion. Then he murmured an additional instruction to the military policeman. Setsuko could not understand the words, but she saw the policeman nod and write quickly. The meaning of those strokes on paper was beyond her, but they felt like a decision taking shape. The medical officer then gave a clear order. It was not for restraints, nor for isolation, nor for throwing her into a separate tent. It was to establish a guard detail for her at once, not for punishment, for protection. To her, however, there was no difference between the two. 2 military policemen left immediately to arrange the watch rotation. The others stayed to restore order. An orderly gathered the fallen instruments and returned them to the tray. The nurse fetched fresh water. A medic adjusted the lamp to focus the light on the wound. In a matter of minutes, the tent shifted from chaos back to a state of calm procedure, as if the earlier storm had been nothing more than a brief flare. In her haze, Setsuko watched it all, unable to discern the meaning. She saw 2 new military policemen take their positions at the foot of her bed, standing straight, unarmed, as if ready to assume a regular duty shift. Their posture gave her a strange illusion, that she had become someone who required constant guarding, not a prisoner to be discarded at will. Her breathing remained shallow, her heart still hammered too fast, but her body, drained of strength, could no longer resist. Her wrists were held, but so lightly that no marks would remain. The bandage was tied again, and she no longer fought it. When the antibacterial ointment stung against the wound, the speed and care of the hands working there dulled the impact. Before leaving, the medical officer paused for half a second at her bedside, watching the rise and fall of her chest. Then he made a small, simple adjustment. He gently pulled her torn collar upward so the fabric would not bunch awkwardly under the bandage. It was not a gesture of courtesy, but a clinical habit. Any unnecessary friction could irritate the wound and lead to new infection. That single motion sent a jolt through her pupils. In her world, the enemy did not straighten her clothes. The enemy did not care whether she was comfortable. The enemy did not treat her skin with such care after she had gone out of control. He offered no explanation. When he was finished, he signaled to the nurse to carry on with follow-up care and left the tent. As the flap fell back into place, the tremor in the air settled into a steady pattern of breathing once more. She lay alone on the bed, feeling as if her body had been emptied of weight. The nurse cleaned the blood from her ear with strokes so light they almost touched nothing at all. Still, she knew those faint traces of warmth came from the enemy, not from comrades. The policeman's footsteps shifted closer, taking positions on either side of the bed in a shallow arc. They held no weapons, only forms and pens. Their orders were to record her mental responses every half hour, her temperature every hour, and to hold her securely whenever she seemed at risk of convulsing or rolling off the bed. It was not the stance of guards preventing an enemy escape. It was the stance of people ensuring she did not die in her own confusion. Outside, dusk pushed the wind lower around the tent. Under the lamp, a thin shadow fell across her face. Her breaths slowed, as if her body had finally found, after extreme chaos, a temporary place to rest. She did not know that this was not mercy. It was because the medical officer had written a single line on her chart. High risk of self-injury, continuous monitoring required. The regulations demanded that she be kept alive. Whatever she tried, fleeing, fighting, harming herself, they were obliged to keep her alive. The guards took their places at the bedside. The night shift medic checked the cleanliness of the thermometer and slid it back into its case. In the tent, the only sounds were the rustle of paper and her unsteady breathing. Setsuko lay under the blanket, her eyes half open. She saw the different sets of charts arranged by category on the metal rack. She saw the thermometers being wiped clean, renumbered, placed neatly in a row, as if waiting for their next contact. For the first time, she realized, the enemy was not waiting for her to submit. They were waiting for her to survive. The night outside blackened around the tent. The shadows of the guards stretched across the floor, swaying slightly as they shifted their weight. Under this quiet watch, Setsuko passed through her first full bout of high fever. At some point, while she hovered in a half-conscious state, the medic finally managed to slip the thermometer into her mouth. She barely reacted, only trembling slightly with her breath. The reading was written on her chart. The nurse adjusted her medication and wiped the sweat from her forehead again. She did not struggle anymore, not because she understood, but because her strength was gone. In her drifting awareness, she noticed that every turn of her body began with someone else's hands. Someone would steady her waist. Someone would support her thigh. Someone would gently lift her arm away from the edge of the bed and tuck it back under the blanket. Whenever she reached up toward the bandage, a palm would be there a second later, catching her wrist. Not hurting, not shouting, not scolding, only making sure she did not tear the wound open herself. Slowly, she understood. These hands were not there to subdue her. They were there to keep her from dying by her own actions. By the next morning, her thoughts were slightly clearer. A guard was counting her pulse. A nurse changed the cool compress on her forehead. For the first time, she watched these actions without panic. She did not cooperate, but she no longer flinched away. This was already a change. In the afternoon, the dressing was replaced. The nurse cleaned away the old, dried blood around her ear with exquisite care, each touch so cautious it was as if she feared to disturb the surface layer of pain. That caution made something tighten in Setsuko's chest, a feeling she could not name. It was neither shame nor fear. At night, as the guard shift changed, the incoming military policeman signed the handover forms. The crisp rasp of paper sounded clearly in the lamplight, like a small, formal announcement of an order she had no part in. That order did not come from her, nor was it about her will, but it quietly shielded her. 3 days later, she could sit halfway up. When the nurse straightened her collar, she did not shrink away. She simply turned her gaze toward the gap in the canvas where the wind slipped in. The breeze stirred the tent wall. Light broke across the floor in broken patches. Before her transfer, she saw the thermometer placed back on the tray. Glass cleaned until clear, numbers aligned, as if it had never been part of chaos. Suddenly she understood. The object that had driven her into frantic terror had only ever existed to confirm that she was still alive. When they helped her up from the bed, 2 military policemen walked on either side. They carried no weapons, only notebooks. Her steps were still weak but steady. For the first time, she left the tent like an ordinary patient, not carried, not pinned, not surrounded by people trying to contain an explosion. On the transfer form, her name appeared under the column marked, "Recovery after light injury." She saw those words and felt her chest constrict slightly. She had never imagined that recovery might be written down as a result attached to her. Outside, the wind carried the salt of the sea. There was no smoke in the air, only the distant low rumble of artillery. a reminder that the battle was not yet over. They led her toward the prisoner-holding area, yet the walk was lighter than she had anticipated. The guards behind her kept an even distance, as if escorting a life, not driving a threat. She realized the enemy had never asked her to change. They had never demanded her submission. They had never required her to understand their language or their rules. They had asked only one thing: that she stay alive. This was more foreign to her than any training she had ever received. When the line of barbed wire appeared ahead, she paused for half a second. In that moment, the taut wire inside her chest finally slackened by a small but perceptible degree. It was not release, but a kind of concession, a concession to life itself. She had once believed that a soldier only had value as long as they could keep fighting. On the soil of an enemy field hospital, at her most deranged, most out of control, and most fragile, a systemized discipline of patience had told her another fact. Even a person who has nothing left to give in service is still counted as worth saving. She stepped into the shadow of the wire. The wind passed over the torn ground. Everything settled back into silence.